Okay, everybody, I wanted to have a conversation about the college football playoffs and specifically the subjectivity in the selection itself because a lot of people are arguing and having all these conversations and getting so upset and not enjoying the game of football because they don't really see how selections for a playoff are really complicated. So let's hop right into it. The college football playoffs are among the most anticipated and debated event in American sport, honestly. And while that offers the promise of crowning a national champion, the process of selecting teams that make it into the playoffs has always been a topic of controversy and debate since it was first instituted in 2014. The common belief is that there are set categories and criteria for selecting teams, in which, to be fair, that was kind of how it was kind of pushed out. But even then, you'll see. So these categories are like win-loss records, strength of schedule, and conference championships. However, the selection process remains inherently subjective, and that is okay because the selection committee is human. So in this video, we're going to explore the subjectivity in the college football playoff selection, even when there appears to be clear and somewhat objective, and there's a reason why I do that, criteria in place. Because the thing is, even if you say these are the categories, as a human, you have to interpret what fits that category and how the team that you're evaluating stacks up to what your standard is for that area. So let's go right into the relativity of criteria. One of the most fundamental issues in college football playoff selection is the relativity of criteria. As I've noted, different individuals may value aspects of their criteria in a myriad of ways. While win-loss records are commonly considered a primary criterion for selection, it's not universally agreed upon that they should be the number one factor. Some people will simply value a win-loss record higher than other criteria, which is interesting because it's just a raw number without interpretation. There is not a statistician worth their salt that will tell you that quoting raw numbers is doing good statistics. You have to interpret, give context, and explain what those raw numbers mean. Fans aren't doing that type of reasoning in their discussions, especially on social media, and people are arguing. With that said, you can substitute a win-loss record with any other category, such as conference champion, eye test, etc. This subjectivity in prioritizing criteria highlights the inherent variability in the selection process, which I will once again say is completely okay, at least in my opinion, because the selection committee is human and you cannot be 100% objective. You cannot divorce yourself from your context and bias as a human. You can be aware of it, and that can help you make a more informed analysis and opinion, but you can't completely void yourself of those things. So then let's talk about how that then impacts the complexity, the complexity of evaluating teams. So another point of contention in the selection process is the complexity of evaluating teams beyond simple win-loss records. Even if you do more interpreting and explaining, I do not believe that the amount of losses you have determines how good of a team you are. Some people do, and I'm not here to fight you about that. I'm just telling you what I think about it, and I'm going to explain why. This perspective challenges the notion that an undefeated team should always take precedence over a team with one or more losses. It raises questions about the quality of opponents, the strength of schedule, and the context in which the wins and losses occur. These are all things that I'm thinking about. So what is the exact and specific methodology for determining the quality of opponents? Have you ever asked that question? How is quality defined in this context? Have you ever asked that question? What's the metric used for that? How is quality measured in this context? So same thing with the strength of schedule. How is that ranking calculated? Who determined the metrics inside that determine the rankings? Then how are those metrics interpreted and determined? These are all questions that, as someone who's doing stats or someone who's thinking about the complexity of what these rankings are and what they mean, these are all things that I think about and what we should think about when it comes to determining who is better than who. So let's also discuss the complexity of a quote, deserving team for the playoffs. That's a term that we use a lot. The term itself should be defined, but let's just assume we all generally know what we mean when we hear it. And so the challenge is somebody put a definition of deserving in the comments, and I want other people to tell that person if they agree with it or disagree with it, and where would they agree and where would they don't. I bet we're going to hear a lot of answers. It's usually tied to wins and losses and conference championships, but it is a subjective category. There is no exact science for the term best team, but it's reasonable to say that a team who is a conference champion, who also is undefeated, has a high deserving score, right? So I'm juxtaposing two things here. You have what's called like the best teams, and you have what is called the deserving teams. So two categories here. Sometimes the team is one and the same. Sometimes the best team is also a really high deserving score team. So I use the term deserving score, and you'll see what I mean. So the conference champion who is undefeated has a high deserving score, for lack of better words. In a hypothetical, a 10-2 team who is better than their record says may not have as high of a deserving score, and this 10-2 team is not a conference champion. So they may not have as high of a deserving score as an undefeated conference champion who is 13-0. Even if you can argue that from a technical standpoint, that 10-2 team is a better team than that conference champion, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be deserving of the playoffs. If we're going to use deserving, like I said, deserving is very subjective, so we'll see what that means. So with all that said, this isn't a smoking gun to me. A high deserving score, is what I'm calling it, a score, this is a metric here, doesn't automatically put you into the playoffs in my book. Now you let me know in the comments, does having a high deserving score automatically put you in the playoffs in your opinion? I don't think so. For example, many fans thought that 2017 conference champion Ohio State should have gotten in over Alabama, who ultimately won the national championship that year. But while Ohio State may have had a higher deserving score, maybe to some people, because once again, they were 11-2, but they were a conference champion. Alabama was 11-1, not a conference champion. Even though they may have had a higher deserving score in some people's eyes, that doesn't mean that it nullifies my other criteria. Because like I said, usually people put wins and losses and deserving conference champion up here at the expense of all of the criteria. Not me. Even within that scenario, some would say Ohio State's deserving score, dropped due to that loss to Iowa. So even within that high deserving, that conference champion deserving score crowd, people differ here. And that Iowa loss, which was a really big and bad loss, was their second loss. So they had more of a big, embarrassing loss, and it was number 2, even though they were conference champions. It may have been different if there were a 1-loss conference champion instead of a 2-loss one. So Ohio State only had lost 1 game that year. Another good example is just from this past year with TCU. They had a very high deserving score because of the undefeated regular season, but my other criteria didn't line up with them being in the playoffs. The loss in their conference championship was the first warning sign. That loss to Georgia in the championship game proved that they weren't one of the 4 best teams in the nation, even though a lot of people thought they were a deserving team, right? But like I said, they lost in that conference championship, so even that takes a hit. And that's not to say that I'm mad or that they were put there or that I would have protested that selection, because I didn't. But rather to show you that having a high deserving score doesn't necessarily make you the better team. And I tend to, in my criteria, I want to go with the best teams, the better teams, more often than say deserving team. Now, there's a limit to that. There's at some point you have to set a boundary, right? Because theoretically, a 9-3 team could be the best team in the nation. They could have gotten super high at the right time, and they were so good, and they probably could beat anybody on any given day at that point. I think there comes a point in time where your results on the field should determine, the deserving score here, it gets high. So if your deserving score is too low, basically, you get into my subjective criteria, then you probably can't get into the playoffs here. And that's what I think. Once again, I'm just highlighting the subjectivity in determining the playoffs. Right? A lot of fans argue that most deserving and win-loss records needs to have a significantly more weight than anything else. And I just disagree with that logic. but I don't disregard the impact of deserving, which is basically what I was just saying. This complexity makes it clear that selecting teams for the playoffs is not a straightforward task. And so let's go a little bit deeper. So let's talk about the subjectivity and ranking methodologies, right? So continuing on here, college football ranking methodologies are often presented as objective and data driven, but they are subject to human interpretation and bias, as is all data and raw numbers. Once again, who made that ranking of teams? How is it calculated? How is strength of record calculated? These questions reveal the black box nature of ranking systems. For those unfamiliar with the concept, a black box is a device or theoretical construct with known or specified performance characteristics, but unknown or unspecified constituents and means of operations. Basically, this means that we understand the output or the results of the rankings, but we don't know what's happening under the hood to produce those results. We don't know the methodology to say this is how the ranking is coming out. Anything created by a human has the implicit biases and preconceptions of the person who made it. That's all code, that's any robots that are made, that's any systems that we use. Like, all of those things have the biases of the person who made in it. This goes for, like I said, artificial intelligence, robots, and yes, statistics. There's no way to completely divorce your personal experiences from the things that you create. You will make decisions based on your personal experiences, whether you want to or not. Connecting back to the black box, the methods and formulas used to determine team rankings are often proprietary and not fully transparent. Consequently, fans and analysts may question the legitimacy of the selection process, although college football fans typically stop at the rankings themselves. And so I think that's kind of like a natural segue here, because then we're going to talk about then the quality of opponents. So let's dive deeper into that understanding of one of those metrics, right? Which is quality of opponents. Evaluating the quality of a team's opponents is a critical aspect of selection, and we hear that all the time. People talk about this team didn't play this team, or this team lost to this year. If we're talking about this year, everyone's like, Alabama can't go ahead of Texas because they lost to Texas. But then Alabama played a harder schedule than Texas, and this is a big circle, and everyone's arguing about what they think is the better criteria. But let's talk about how difficult it is to even talk about evaluating the quality of an opponent. All right, evaluating the quality of a team's opponent is a critical aspect, and if it's simply what is your opponent's win-loss record, that is not helpful. Determining the quality of opponents is far from straightforward. Simply looking at whether a team won or lost is an incomplete assessment. How do we determine the quality of that opponent? Consider the strength of an opponent's opponent is vital for a more accurate understanding of a team's performance. And this is just going to add another layer of subjectivity to the selection process, because then you have to figure out, like, well, this team played, Texas, and then Texas played like those guys, and those guys played those guys. And before you know it, you're down a rabbit trail. And you're trying to determine, like, well, is this conference better than this conference? Well, how would you know if you haven't taken the time to painstakingly assess and evaluate every team in every conference, consider their injury history, consider when they played in a year, consider their record at the end of the year after we see everything in the end, because that happens in years past. I know with Alabama specifically, where some people say, oh, Alabama had a weak schedule. Then when you look back at their schedule, it's like, oh, the majority of the teams they played were actually 7 and 8 wins, so all bowl teams. And you go like, oh, okay, well, you didn't realize that as the season was going on. So it's those type of things that people don't consider. They just see what they see in the moment, and they try to evaluate an opponent's opponents. And you're like, how can you do that? There's not really a straightforward way of doing that. So then, I've mentioned it already, but then that kind of gets into conference bias and subjectivity. This naturally leads to like that point of contention in the playoff selection conversation. Conference superiority and bias. Conference affiliation often plays a significant role in team selection due to perceptions about the quality of opponents, leading to debates about conference superiority. And there is no exact science in determining who is the better conference. As stated above, it can't simply be wins and losses, because that's just a raw number without an interpretation. Those raw numbers have to be interpreted, and that rightfully adds subjectivity. This highlights the subjectivity involved in evaluating teams based on their conference and the implicit biases that can arise from those affiliations. Fans tend to think that their conference is underrated and that X other conference is overrated, and that's usually the fundamental attribution error there, where you underestimate the things about yourself that are wrong, and you overestimate the things that are wrong about someone else. And people do that a lot. That's the fundamental attribution error. So, I'm giving you a lot of philosophy terms here today. But that happens a lot when it comes to determining conference superiority and the biases there. So all here, I think we all hear about all this Power 5 conference teams saying this type of thing over and over and over again. And it gets old, it gets tiring because it's not really helpful. So what does this mean? In conclusion, right? I believe what I just said illustrates the subjectivity, which once again is completely okay because we're human and that should be expected, that's involved in the college football playoff selection. Even when there appears to be a clear and somewhat objective categories for selection, the relativity of criteria, the complexity of evaluating teams, the subjectivity in ranking methodologies, and the challenges in determining the quality of opponents all contribute to the subjectivity of the process. As long as humans are involved in making these decisions, subjectivity will persist. And debates about the fairness and accuracy of the college football playoff selection process will continue as long as people ignore that point because they are upset that their team didn't get in. There is no guaranteed formula for making the playoffs, and I am 100% okay with that. And I argue that you should be too. If you don't think so, let me know in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about this video as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see y'all next time.